Hey guys, welcome to the day 7 video. Today we're going to talk about essentially fallacies, the most common and most interesting types of fallacies. So these are essentially common mistakes and reasons. And we'll also talk about how to disagree with someone and what are better and worse ways to do that. Afterwards, remember, go ahead and you're going to want to get into Google Classroom and do the associated quiz. And then come to class already getting a decent idea of these fallacies, and we'll essentially spend class mastering and applying them. Um, now, there's going to be quite a lot of fallacies here. So if you feel like you need to take a break, well, that's what's so easy about a video. Right? Go ahead and give your mind a mental break, come back to the video, make sure you watch the entire video and take the quiz. Okay, we're going to start with this. So here's essentially a chart of how do you logically disagree with someone? So someone says something you disagree with, they give you an argument. How can you respond? What's the best way that you can respond? So essentially, here we got a triangle where the top is the best way, the bottom is the worst way. So let's say I give you the following argument. Let's say we're talking about the death penalty, and I say, well, the death penalty is something we need to have for a very simple reason. The death penalty essentially scares people into committing less crimes. Before committing a crime, they think to themselves, oh, wait, what happens if I get caught? I can get the death penalty. I definitely don't want to die. So I'm going to think again, or at least some people will think again about committing the crime and will have less crime. And shouldn't we have less crime and do whatever it takes to have less crime? So we should have the death penalty. This is known as the deterrence argument for the death penalty. Now, let's say you disagree. How can you reply to something like this? So, the best way you can is essentially by refuting the central point. And refuting the central point means you take the part of the argument that is the most important, right? And in the argument I just gave you, the idea that the death penalty deters people from committing crime, that it gets people to commit less crimes, is really the key point the argument makes. If you can show that that point is wrong, congratulations, you've demolished this argument. Now, how can you do that? Well, let's say you do something like this. Let's say, well, that's actually not true. A recent study came out of the, pick your journal, let's say Journal of American Criminology, that actually looked at the issue and concluded quite conclusively that the death penalty does not decrease crime, and actually it sometimes leads to increase in crime. Okay, if that is true, if you are successful, congratulations, you demolished this argument. Now, let's say you don't have something like that. Okay, what's the next best thing? Well, the next best thing is called a refutation. A refutation is essentially, again, you have managed to show that the argument doesn't work. So, refutation is you refuted the argument the person made. Maybe you can't attack their central point, but maybe there's something else about the argument that is still vulnerable. For example, notice the argument I gave you didn't actually provide any statistical support. So you might reply and say, well, I mean, it's possible that the death penalty reduces crime, but you haven't given me any actual data to support this. And until you do, there's no reason for me to be convinced. All right, so notice essentially you're saying the argument doesn't work without more evidence. That means the argument doesn't work. Right? But it's not as good as the first time because now someone could potentially come back with evidence. Okay, next one. Let's say you can't even find a problem with the argument that they're making. The next thing down is a counter argument. And a counter argument is essentially an argument for your own side. So you're not refuting the other person's argument, right? Their argument is still here, but you're adding your own argument here, right? So what you're going to end up with is one argument for both sides if you're successful. So let's say you say, well, I'm really not sure about that, but I can tell you this. The death penalty inevitably ends up killing innocent people. And we make mistakes, our system makes mistakes. We know that many people on death row and who have been killed through the death penalty have turned out to be innocent. Killing innocent people is wrong. Therefore, we shouldn't have the death penalty. Okay, again, notice you didn't refute the other person's argument, right? You didn't show there's anything wrong with it. That argument still stands, but now you got your own argument to stand against it. Okay, next one down is contradiction. Contradiction is super simple. It goes like this: you're wrong, or I disagree. And that's about it. Right? There's really nothing more you have. You're not really refuting. You're not really saying why they're wrong. You're not really giving your own reasons for why you think they're wrong for any reason outside of their argument. You're just expressing disagreement. That's about it. Let's say you can't even do that. Lower one down is responding to tone. That's essentially saying, I don't like the way you said that. Right? I don't like the tone of your voice. Now notice I didn't say you were wrong. And that's the key part, right? You're not even contradicting what they say. You're just expressing criticism of the way they said it. All right, below that is the number one fallacy, the most common fallacy, which is called the ad hominem. With the ad hominem, essentially, you're attacking the characteristics or authority of the writer or the person speaking. Essentially, you're attacking the person instead of what they're actually saying, instead of what the argument is. And right below, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and right below that is name calling. Name calling, you're not even referencing the argument. You're not even referencing anything. You're just calling the guy, whatever it is, in this case, an asshat, whatever an asshat is. Okay, so notice refuting the central point, refutation, counter-argument, contradiction, responding to tone, then the ad hominem, and then name calling. Ad hominems are right above name calling, essentially terrible ways, logically speaking, to disagree with someone. Okay, before we start, I'm going to give you here all of the fallacies, starting with the number one most common fallacy, which is the ad hominem. Before I do that, I highly suggest that you go to Google Classroom and download our fallacy handout. So the fallacy handout has essentially all the fallacies I'm going to talk about. I highly recommend that you find for each fallacy an example that you can use, an example that really kind of speaks to you and makes it easy to remember what the fallacy is about. Okay, our very first fallacy is going to be the ad hominem. And the ad hominem is very simply, you're attacking the person instead of what they say. I'm going to use this guy to explain it, and I'll use him throughout the lecture today.
The ad hominem attack. Ad hominem criticism is where, instead of criticizing the argument or ideas of the person with whom you are conversing, you criticize the person themselves, and in so doing claim you have also criticized their argument. And boy, is this one popular. Ad hominem criticisms are not always, but are very frequently fallacious. Unless the character or actions of the person making an argument are directly related to the matter at hand, criticizing them and not their ideas is a fallacy. Ad hominem attacks are the bread and butter of political advertising. Criticizing a candidate and saying that because their character is bad, their ideas and policies are also bad. John Smith literally hates little children, and so his ideas about salmon fishery safety regulations are wrong. Dead wrong. A related fallacy is tu quo qui, where it is argued that a person making an argument has behaved in a way inconsistent with that argument. Their behavior might be inconsistent, but it doesn't necessarily make their argument wrong. For example, it's really important for fast food restaurants to be clear about the salt, fat, and sugar content of their food, doubly so because of how cheap it is. Obesity is a real problem in America. What business do you have asking companies to disclose this stuff? I saw you eat 2 Big Macs and drink 34 ounces of Hi-C orange lava burst yesterday. This is an ad hominem tu quo qui attack. Mike argues for the presence of certain dietary information, and Straw Mike says that based on his behavior, he lacks the authority to do so. Straw Mike's response doesn't at all approach the point Mike is making, though. Mike is arguing that if certain dietary information were widely available, it's possible that an effect on obesity would occur. Ad hominem attacks make it so the person being attacked suddenly has to defend their character, and not their ideas, when in fact their character has no bearing on the conversation whatsoever. And also, it's mean. You seem like a nice person. No need for insults.
Okay, so here it is, right? Essentially, you're rejecting someone's claim based on some sort of character flaw. This is the first version of the ad hominem, and we're going to talk about 3 versions, actually. This is the abusive version, the personal attack version. You're attacking a person's character instead of what they're saying. Now, here are a few examples for you to think about it. But before we do, the form essentially goes like this, right? Person X has some sort of negative feature F, and because of that, what they think is wrong. And notice there's no focus on really why is it what they think is wrong for its own sake. So let's say Alex says, look, we really need to fund universal pre-K. There's a lot of data that shows that kids do much better in school later on, and that overall this is really good for society. But, Alex is kind of a nasty person, so I'm sure it's wrong. Notice what I did, right? I essentially dismissed what Alex said for no reason other than an attack on the kind of person that he is. Here's another one. Yeah, I know Charles has been working as a CPA, that's someone that does taxes, let's say, an accountant, for the last 15 years, but he cheats on his girlfriend. And, you really should not take advice from a cheater. Notice, again, right, the idea is that by calling him a cheater, you seem to be dismissing his ability as a CPA, as an accountant. But those two things have nothing to do with each other, right? Instead of attacking his ability, you're attacking his character. Here's another one. The war protesters are saying that the war is really a waste of lives and money, but they're just cowards who don't want to fight. All right, they're just cowards that don't want to fight. Might be true. Who knows? It really might. But that has nothing to do with whether or not what they say is true, whether or not the war is a waste of money and lives. Finally, here's another one. This is one of my favorite kinds. Jessica says that El Mare is the best Mexican restaurant in town. They make 11 types of original salsas. They have really incredible mole, and everything is incredibly fresh. But what does she know? She's Japanese. Notice, right, being Japanese is not a character flaw, but it's made to seem as if it's a character flaw when it comes to understanding Mexican food. But the two things really have nothing in common, right? Whether her ideas about what makes that restaurant the best Mexican restaurant in town are true or not really depends on how good those ideas are, not on whether she is Japanese or Mexican or anything else. Okay, so that's the most common form of the ad hominem fallacy. Let's look at another one. Okay, the second one is the circumstantial ad hominem. This one can be a little tricky. So essentially, you're attacking not the person's character, but their circumstances, and these are irrelevant circumstances. And that's where you kind of want to think about, right? Whether the circumstances matter or not for how they're making the claim. Again, you're doing this instead of actually looking at how valid the claim is. So it goes essentially like this. This person is biased, and because of this, what they say is wrong. You're attacking their motive instead of really how good their argument is. Now, it's really important to recognize when someone is biased, right? That's something you need to know. And sometimes when people are biased, essentially we dismiss what they say because, well, their bias gives us a relevant reason to dismiss what they say. So, for example, here's a case where you have someone with a bias where it wouldn't be a fallacy. Crusher Catpiano has testified that mob hitman Sam Milano was at the movies at the time the mob informer was gunned down. But Castellano was paid $30,000 by the mob for his testimony. Therefore, his testimony cannot be trusted. Right? If you're asking someone to report what happened and you know that they're biased, let's say because they got money, right, that gives you very good reason not to listen to what they say. But notice, it's not really like Castellano is giving an argument. He's just telling people what he saw. So here's another version of this. This one would be a fallacy because the circumstances are irrelevant for the argument. Nancy says that the drinking age should be reduced from 21 to 18. She argues that if you're considered responsible enough to fire a gun and be drafted, there's no reason why you shouldn't be considered responsible enough to drink. But she's 19 years old and would like to drink legally. So her argument is wrong. Well, maybe she is 19 years old and would like to drink illegally, but she did actually give you, an actual argument. She gave you reasons. And those reasons have to be dealt with. Again, notice San Milano here, or sorry, Crusher Catiano, doesn't actually give you reasons. He just gives you, let's say, what he says he saw. In Nancy's situation, she's giving you an actual argument, and you can't just say, oh, Nancy, you just want to drink, you just want this to be true. You have to actually deal with the argument she gave you. Here's another one. So, the American Association of E-Cigarette Producers says that there's no credible evidence that e-cigarettes have health risks. Given how much they have at stake, which is a lot of money, and their obvious bias, they want you to think their stuff is safe, you should take their claims with a grain of salt. A grain of salt means that you should not take them very seriously. You want to look for a more credible source of information about whether or not they're safe, a source that's not biased. So, not a fallacy. Again, notice they're not really giving you an argument, they're just telling you that there's no evidence. In this case, okay, LeBron James claims that professional athletes deserve higher salaries because they entertain millions of people and make millions for their team owners. But he just wants to protect his incredibly high salary. Does he want to protect his incredibly high salary? Maybe, but that doesn't mean that he's wrong about the reasons he's giving. Again, notice he's giving you reasons, right? About the reasons he's giving for why professional athletes deserve this money. Okay, again, notice in both cases where you had a fallacy, reasons were given, an argument was made, and the argument was just ignored based on the motive of the person. All right, the third and final version of the ad hominem is the inconsistency ad hominem. Here you're attacking the person's inconsistencies to refute her beliefs, again, instead of the argument, right? Instead of the argument they give you, instead of the reasons they give you, you're attacking them for being inconsistent. And it essentially goes like this. X gives you advice but fails to follow their own advice. So X's claim should be rejected. Here's the most classic version. Right? So the most classic version is essentially mom catches her teenage daughter with cigarettes. And she says, I can't believe you smoke. Smoking is terrible for you. You really shouldn't smoke. It can really dramatically raise your chances of emphysema and cancer. It's a terrible, terrible habit. And the daughter goes, but mom, why should I listen to you? You smoke. Well, it's quite possible that the mom smokes, but that doesn't mean that everything she just said about the harms of smoking is wrong. In fact, smoking is a classic situation where lots of people do it, but think it's not a good idea to do. Or let's say we have this guy. This is your doctor, and you go see your doctor, and your doctor says, I got to tell you, you really need to lose about quite a lot. Let's say like 30 pounds really quickly. Your health really requires it. Essentially, at this point, you're getting to the point where you are probably going to become pre-diabetic or diabetic. It's getting dangerous. You really need to do it. And you might say, well, doctor, look at you. I mean, you're obese as well. Why should I listen to you? But of course, his expertise here is as a doctor, and whether or not he followed his expertise has nothing to do with the reasons he's giving you for why you should lose weight. And of course, this happens in politics as well, as almost every fallacy does. Here's Donald Trump essentially saying, why is Barack Obama, this is before Donald Trump became president, constantly issuing executive orders that are major power grabs of authority? Right? So the idea of executive orders, they're essentially things where the president decides, we're going to do it based on what I say instead of going through Congress. Now, you might say, well, look, why should I listen to Donald Trump? Donald Trump, as president, has had lots and lots and lots of executive orders, right? Even more than Obama. He didn't follow his advice, so it must be bad advice. But that actually doesn't mean it's bad advice, right? Maybe executive orders are major power grabs that a president shouldn't do, and maybe Trump was right the first time. Okay, our next fallacy is the straw person fallacy. And the straw person fallacy is the second most common fallacy. It's a fallacy we do all the time. You did it in your debates. Everyone does it in their debates. I do it every time I argue with my wife, practically. Okay? Here's how it goes. I'll play the video and then we'll talk about it.
The strawman fallacy. Contrary to what many people would have us believe, a straw man is not simply an argument that you dislike or find inconvenient. Rather, it is a version of an argument that is misrepresented, simplified, so that it is easier to knock over. Just as an actual man made of straw is a less solid version of a man made of flesh, a straw man argument is a less solid version of a fully fleshed out argument. A straw man replaces or represents whatever actual argument is being made. Straw manning can come in many different forms. It's not even always intentional. You might accidentally construct a straw man if you don't fully understand the depth of an argument. And that is fine. It happens to the best of us. However, to intentionally misread or misrepresent an argument to simplify the process of discrediting it, that's a little bit less forgivable. To take nuanced points out of context, to ignore crucial information, to even exaggerate claims to the point of absurdity, which is then easier to refute, these are all straw man tactics. For example, Mike and Straw Mike are having a conversation about how to responsibly depict awful stuff in media. I don't think it's too much to ask that when a media creator wants to show heinous or awful stuff, they do so in a context that shows that that stuff is heinous and awful. Oh, so now we're not allowed to show violent or terrible things unless we include some long-winded sermon about how bad things are bad? I think creators should be able to show or do whatever they want. The original argument states a preference for what Mike thinks constitutes the responsible use of media. The straw man argument recasts this as something much simpler and easier to agree with. Freedom is good, censorship is bad. But now Mike and Straw Mike are no longer arguing about the same point, and so the conversation will quickly become unfocused and aggressive, which is never fun. If you're gonna win an argument, you want to win against what the other side actually thinks, don't you? A straw man argument keeps that from happening.
Okay, so notice the idea here, right? You're rebutting the position by essentially mischaracterizing what the other person says, right? A really common way that this is done is, let's say, if you say, "Oh, so what you're saying is," and then you don't actually say what they're saying. You're saying something completely different that makes them seem really ridiculous, right? For example, my wife asked me to wash the dishes, and I say, "Oh, so what you're saying is that I should always be the one that washes the dishes and you never wash the dishes? Oh, no, that's crazy. I'm not doing it." Virtually every time we say, "So what you're saying," we seem to not be actually repeating what people are saying. Um, okay, so here's a few examples, right? So again, the straw person is going to be you're mischaracterizing, a lot of times by exaggerating the position. So this is Rush Limbaugh, a conservative radio commentator, and he says, "I'm a very controversial figure to the animal rights movement. They no doubt view me with some measure of hostility because I'm constantly challenging their fundamental premise that animals are superior to human beings." Now, notice the key part here is the animals are superior to human beings. That sounds ridiculous. But that's not what the animal rights people say. They just say animals deserve some rights or protections. That seems a lot more reasonable. By exaggerating their position, right, to the point where it seems ridiculous, Rush Limbaugh can essentially say, "See, they're stupid, I'm right," and win the argument. Right? That's the straw person fallacy. Or how about this one? Senator Jones says that we should not fund the attack submarine program. I disagree entirely. I can't understand why he wants to leave us defenseless like that. Again, notice, Senator Jones never said anything about being defenseless. He didn't want to defund the military. He just talked about one program. That doesn't seem that unreasonable, but if you exaggerate it to the point of leaving us defenseless, now it seems crazy and ridiculous and wrong. Again, notice you got the same thing going on. You're changing what the person said or what that group said. Here's one that's also a rhetorical definition. Atheism, the belief that there was nothing and nothing happened to nothing and then nothing magically exploded for no reason, creating everything. And then a bunch of everything magically rearranged itself for no reason whatsoever into self-replicating bits which then turn into dinosaurs. Makes perfect sense. Okay, now notice what's going on here, right? Essentially, by using sarcasm and ridicule here and really misrepresenting the view of atheism, right? You're making it seem really ridiculous and why would anyone believe this? Okay, so that is the straw person. Okay, Our next fallacy, and again, one of the most common fallacies, is the false dilemma. The false dilemma is really simple. Essentially, it goes like this: you're told you have two options, this option or this option, when really you actually have quite a few more options. Right? It gives you the false notion that you have a dilemma, a choice between only two options. Here's my man giving you his video.
The black and white fallacy. A black and white fallacy is where you present limited choices as the only choices, when in fact additional options do exist.
It's time to choose.
Sometimes called the false dichotomy or false dilemma, the black and white fallacy is a really easy way of eradicating complexity and nuance. The most common black and white fallacy is the old saying, either you're for us or against us, when in fact it's highly likely one might find arguments on either side of a position appealing, and therefore occupy some previously unannounced space on a continuum between the two positions. Much of governmental and gender politics, for example, operate on a very widely spread adoption of a black and white fallacy. Sometimes the black and white fallacy presents a dichotomy between two things that are not actually opposites or mutually exclusive. No continuum exists between those two things because they are not related to each other in the way that the black and white fallacy presents them to be. For example, it would be nice to have more well-written, playable female characters in video games. If you want more playable female characters, that means you must want fewer male characters, and those are the ones that I like the most. Are you trying to ruin games? In this situation, Straw Mike's black and white fallacy is that in games, either specifically or generally, there can only be male or female characters. Having more of one automatically means that there is less of the other. That is not the case. More of something is not always automatically less of its opposite, and so this dichotomy is false. The black and white fallacy presents nuanced arguments as being, well, black and white, and presents only extremes as being available for further discussion, even when that's not the case. What are you doing? Are you backing down from a challenge? That's not like you.
Okay. So again, notice what happened. Let's say the conversation between Straw Mike and Mike. The idea that you should have more playable female characters. Straw Mike essentially said, well, if you have more of those, then you're going to have less male characters, and he likes to play male characters. But notice that works on a false assumption that you have to have either one or the other as opposed to both. And as lots of games show, it's quite easy to put both in a game. Okay, hence the false dilemma. There's the third option of putting both in a game. The idea that you're either part of the problem or part of the solution, maybe you might say, I'm part of neither. Here's one. Since you don't spend a lot, you must be saving a lot. Well, that's true if you make a lot, but not if you don't actually make a lot. You don't spend a lot because you just don't have a lot of money, right? You're not saving anything either. So notice the rich person here is assuming that there's two options. You're spending or you're saving, but those are not the two options available to someone without a lot of money. I love this one. Who would you rather see live? It's very clever. Okay, so notice what's going on here, right? The rat, her. This is from researchsaves.org. Essentially, the idea here is that some animal rights activists want to eliminate or dramatically reduce the use of animals in research. And this organization is advocating for using animals in research. And the idea that they're implying here is that we have a choice. Either the rat lives, or mouse in this case, or the little girl is going to live. One of these are going to die. Which one do you want to die? And the assumption, of course, is you're going to go with the girl. But maybe that's not the situation. Maybe it's not like one of them has to die. Maybe both of them can live, right? Animal rights advocates would argue that that's the case. Our next are appeals to the people. Appeals to the people are essentially a range of fallacies that all work in the same way. So let's start with the first one, appeals to popularity. Appeals to popularity essentially says that you're accepting a claim on the grounds that most people of some group other than expert, and that means essentially, let's say most people in your country, most people that you know, believe it to be true. Okay? So let's say most people thought that Green Book was a poor choice for for Best Picture Oscar of 2019. So it must have been a poor choice for Best Picture. Well, not necessarily, right? Maybe it was, but just because most people thought so doesn't make it so. Um, Essentially, it's going to be a question of what are the actual reasons there are to think that it wasn't a good choice. Experts typically focus on reasons. That's why it says other than experts. Think of another one. Let's say most people in America think that video games are too violent. Does that really mean that video games are too violent? Not at all. It just means that most people think that, and most people could be wrong. Here's another version of that. So instead of focusing on what people think, now you're focusing on what people do. So appeal to common practice essentially is you're justifying doing something because, well, lots of people do it, right? So this is the everyone does it approach. It's okay for me to cheat on my taxes because everybody cheats on their taxes. Well, first of all, not everybody cheats on their taxes, but let's say it was true. That by itself doesn't give you a reason, right? You still need to give a regular reason why it would be okay to do that, right? Or if you said, let's say, it's okay to use drugs in baseball, steroids in baseball, because lots of athletes use steroids in baseball. Well, maybe lots of them do, but again, that doesn't make it right. Okay, so notice again, this works on the idea that, well, people can be wrong, and just because they think something, well, that doesn't make it true. All right, then you have the appeal to tradition. And appeal to tradition essentially can be either with thinking or doing something, but essentially it means that you're justifying a claim or an action on the grounds that this is what people have traditionally believed or done, right? So if you can see the picture next to it, that's a bris. So that's a Jewish bris. So I'm Jewish, and when my son was born, before that, I wanted to have a bris, and I told my wife, "Yeah, we need to organize a bris." And my wife said, "Whoa, hold on, wait a minute. You're talking about having a party where people come, and my son gets a part of his penis cut off, and they celebrate that. Why in the world should we do that?" And I said, "Well, baby, it's tradition. We're Jews. That's how it goes." And she said, "Well, so what?" And notice the so what, right? I mean, she was right. Just because it's tradition doesn't mean it's a good tradition, right? There's good traditions and there's bad traditions. In order to evaluate whether it's a good idea, the tradition part doesn't actually matter. And what matters is what does it give, right? What does it provide? What's the good? What's the bad? Okay. Next, slippery slope. The slippery slope one is a fun one. Essentially, the slippery slope idea is if you take one step, you're taking a step, and next thing you know, you're sliding down into a pile of a whole bunch of bad stuff. Okay? So you're claiming that if X happens, then essentially Y is going to happen, and if Y happens, then Z is going to happen. But you're not actually giving any good reason to think that X will actually lead to Y, which will actually lead to Z. So let's say I asked you to turn your phones off in class. And somebody said, well, no, you really shouldn't ask us to turn your phones off in class because if you do, next thing you know, you're going to make us turn off our phones during the break. And if we do that, next thing you know, you're going to make us use our shoes to smash our phones. And that is crazy wrong. You can't ask us to do that. So you really should not ask us to turn our phones off in class. Okay, again, notice how that works. If you take the first step, you're automatically going to end up in the last step. But no good reasons are given for why that's the case. The slippery slope, I think, most commonly in public debates is used for things like gay marriage. So this is a classic one for gay marriage, right? The idea of if you allow people to have gay marriage, next thing you know, you're going to have to allow people to marry multiple people, and before you know it, people will be marrying their dogs, and that's just crazy. We can't do that. So we can't allow gay marriage. This was part of the debate in the United States when gay marriage was being debated, and it's been a part of, as far as I know, literally every place that's debated gay marriage. Now, it seems crazy to kind of go from gay marriage to dog, and very few people have explained how. One guy, Stanley Kurtz, in an article that I used to use when discussing this issue, did give an argument that kind of breaks down how it's supposed to work, and here's how it goes. So, if we allow gay marriage, then, well, gay men, they're very promiscuous. And that's how he kind of puts it. Obviously, he's relying here on a stereotype, but a stereotype that is also backed by evidence that gay men do tend to have more partners than other kind of couples. Um, so Stanley Kurtz says, well, they're not going to be satisfied with gay marriage. They're going to want open gay marriage. And if they want open gay marriage, essentially they're not going to be satisfied with that. They're going to demand polygamy, and we're going to give it to them. And if they have polygamy, then essentially what's going to happen is other people are going to look at them and they're going to say, well, I don't think monogamy matters either, I guess. I want to have sex with lots of people too. So you're going to have lots of people having lots of sex, general promiscuity everywhere, and this is going to just destroy monogamy. And that will end up really destroying society, and we can't allow monogamy to just be destroyed. Right? So, we can't allow gay marriage. Next, we have begging the question, or what is often called a circular argument. Right? And essentially, you're assuming as true a claim that is at issue, and you're doing this as if you were giving an argument. So, what you're actually doing is you're using the claim as a reason for itself being true, doing a circle. All makes sense when you look at this. So here's probably the most classic example of begging the question. God exists because the Bible says so. How do you know that the Bible is right? Well, that's easy because the Bible is the Word of God. And I've had essentially Jews, Christians, and Muslims all give me this argument in my philosophy class about religion. And again, notice what's wrong with the argument. As the image shows, you're justifying God because of the Bible, and you're justifying the Bible because of God. But you don't have anything independent here that is justifying either one of these. Okay? They're justifying each other in a circle. Or how about this one? Of course, my salary is higher than yours. That's because my work is more important. Why is my work more important? Well, my salary is higher, isn't it? Okay, again, notice, right? You are essentially here using the idea that higher salary is justified based on more important work. But what is more important? You're essentially using the idea that importance is based on higher salary. And essentially, again, you got the circle where high salary justifies more important. More important is literally the same thing as a higher salary. And you have no independent justification of, well, why does a higher salary relate to, sorry, let me put it a different way. And you have no justification, no independent justification for why this person is actually getting paid more, or what makes the work more important. Okay, here's essentially another one. So this is for one of the papers that I've gotten for one of my ethics classes. A really common thing that students do is do this, and notice essentially it's a repetition. You can't morally refuse service to someone because they're gay, and serving them is against your religion. This is because it's wrong to deny service to someone just because they're gay, even if this goes against your religion. So you can't do it because it's wrong, and the reason for this is that it's wrong and you can't do it. Okay? Notice it felt to them like they were actually giving an argument, but really their argument was, I'm right because I'm right. Right? This is right because it's right. And notice you're begging the question there. You've got a circle. Okay, our next one is one of the most fun ones, I think, the post hoc fallacy. So essentially, you're assuming because one thing happened after another thing, it must have happened as a result of it. So this is often known as confusing correlation with causation, right? Because something came after something else, it must have caused it. So a classic one is, let's say, the idea of a lucky socks. So let's say Jamie wore these socks to a game, right? Let's say to a baseball game. And during that baseball game, he hit 3 home runs. Right? He'll now think, well, I hit those home runs because I wore these socks, and these socks are lucky. These must be my lucky socks. Okay? Again, notice this idea of he wore the socks, then he hit 3 home runs. Does that mean that the socks caused him to hit 3 home runs? Well, clearly not, right? It's that confusion that creates the post hoc. Think of another one. Think of, let's say, someone is sick and you pray and they get better, right? And the assumption then becomes for many people, see, I prayed and then they got better, so the prayer worked. It made them better. But we have no idea if they got better because the prayer worked or for any other reason. Essentially, we know there must be a reason, but it could be lots of other reasons. You're confusing correlation that one happened before the other with the idea that one caused the other. My favorite is maybe this one, second favorite. When the iPod came out, there was a bump in crime that year. And New Yorker magazine had one article where a guy essentially argued that the reason there was a bump in crime was because of the iPad, okay? Or iPod. Right? iPod comes out, then you get increased crime. It must be the iPod that actually led to increased crime. And then you have lots of things like this, right? Same-sex marriage essentially leads to climate change disasters. When Hurricane Katrina hit, there were conservative commentators that essentially said, see, same-sex marriage was legalized in some states, and then we had the Hurricane Katrina. It was really terrible. It must mean that God is upset and punishing us for our sins, right? Same-sex marriage happened, then disaster happened. It must have been because of the same-sex marriage. Okay, again, with all of these, there's no real good reason to think that one caused the other, simply other than that one came before the other. Okay? Scientists focus a lot on causation and try to figure out what actually causes something else, and it's really a complicated thing to do that we'll talk about next week. Okay. Our final one really has to do with the question of credibility, right? Are your papers credible? When you say something, let's say in your papers, about the historical use of digital cameras, right? In the let's say late 20th century, right? Should I trust what you say? Well, probably not, right? If you're making a claim about the world, to have credibility, you really need to be an expert on that subject. Are you really an expert on the subject? Probably not. I mean, you're still in school. And if you refer to statistics, I mean, did you gather those statistics yourself? Well, not unless you did an undergraduate study, right? Most of the times what you do is you essentially go and find real experts, right? You cite these experts and then you take their experts. You take their credibility as your own. Right? Essentially, this is what happens every time you cite a paper. Your paper is credible because it's depending on references to credible experts. So where do you turn to for the experts? And how do you decide who is an expert on something? So that's the next thing we want to think about. Right? The inappropriate appeal to authority is essentially where you do this wrong. You are treating someone as an expert who is not really an expert. All right, so here's our guy here.
Authority fallacy. The authority fallacy holds that because someone in a position of assumed authority has said something, that thing must be true. However, the authority fallacy is just as important for what it isn't. It isn't meant to defeat statements made by experts or by scientific consensus. Saying that global warming is true and man-made because the vast majority of scientists that study it produce evidence that support this claim is not an example of the authority fallacy. Neither is stating, for instance, that all medical technology is blind to race based on Lundy Calderon's exhaustive research of the spirometer. The scientific community and experts in their field of study are authorities. The authority fallacy applies this level of respect for authority to people who don't actually possess it. The first-hand accounts of our friends, family members, and coworkers do not constitute authority and therefore truth. Unless, of course, they also happen to be experts. For example, Mike and Straw Mike are talking about automobile manufacturing. Whoa, Korean cars in America are so cheap. I wonder how they do that. Well, my uncle is a mechanical engineer, and he says that it's because they use terrible, cheap parts. You are literally trading money for safety. Straw Mike's uncle might be an engineer, and that's awesome, but it doesn't necessarily give him the authority to talk about the construction of certain parts in vehicles. This is an authority fallacy unless it turns out Straw Mike's uncle is an independent researcher conducting a peer-reviewed study on the international automobile industry and its effects on safety. The authority fallacy trades actual points for external, non-expert anecdotes, the plural of which, you might have heard, is not data. Your uncle seems like a really cool guy, but I bet you can win this argument without him.
First of all, let's go back to the idea of an appropriate appeal to authority. Again, what you're doing is you're treating someone as an expert who isn't an expert. I really like the example with that guy's uncle, who's an engineer, right? Because originally that might sound compelling, right? Engineers know cars, right? He knows cars. But notice how specific the subject is, right? Korean cars, why are they so cheap? To really be an authority, you need to study something very specifically. So let me give you a few examples of an inappropriate appeal to authority. This is one of my favorites. Airborne is a product you see in every American airport. It's huge. And it's designed essentially to, at least it says, not get you sick. Though they are not actually allowed to say that anymore. They used to have on the package essentially that it prevents you from getting sick, and because well, it doesn't do anything other than give you a bunch of vitamins. It doesn't actually do that. Now, their claim to fame here, and the way they get you, the way they bring you in, is by saying created by a school teacher, right? And the idea is you're on a plane, you might get sick. You know who else could get sick? School teachers. They're around sick kids all the time, right? What's their secret? Okay, so the idea here, notice, is that you're treating a school teacher as an expert. But is a school teacher really an expert on how to prevent colds from happening? Really more than, let's say, a team of highly trained pharmacologists with PhDs in microbiology, and years of experience and postdocs, etc.? Well, clearly not. Her husband was a marketing person, and he essentially figured out how to do this. Yet millions of people fall for it every year. It's not that it doesn't do anything, it's vitamins, and vitamins are good for you. You could take Emergency, it'll do the same thing, just give you a bunch of vitamins, and that could give you a boost. But it's not going to, let's say, go and do anything beyond that, prevent colds in any way. Okay, here's another one. Let's say I go to Dr. Riaz here, and Dr. Riaz is an orthopedist. Orthopedist means she's a bone doctor, right? And I go to her, my shoulder really hurts, and she takes an x-ray on my shoulders, and she says, I think you have cancer, right? I think you have lung cancer as I'm looking at this x-ray. Is she an expert on this? How seriously should I take what she says? Now, notice, she is a doctor, right? Her opinion here is very different than, let's say, the opinion of, let's say, anybody that just looks at an x-ray. She's a doctor and she has been trained to look at x-rays. However, she's not a cancer doctor, right? She's a bone doctor. So her expertise is not as high as it could be, right? Let's say it's a medium level expertise, right? The appropriate thing to do at this point is take what she says with a grain of salt, don't take it seriously, and go to a real expert, a very specific person who can authoritatively tell you what's going on with you. All right, here's another one. Let me talk about this one in a minute with things to consider. So things to consider is, first of all, does the person have sufficient expertise in the subject? So think about Dr. Rios for a moment, right? She has some expertise, but not enough. Does the school teacher have expertise on the subject of how to prevent colds chemically? The answer is no. Second, is there a wide agreement on this subject between other experts in the field? Okay, so this is a big one. So let's say now we go to Dr. Chen over here in the right corner, and Dr. Chen is a climatologist, okay? And Dr. Chen has a PhD in climatology. He has publications, and Dr. Chen says that climate change is not the product of human activity. Now, he is an expert, and he does have enough expert, but this is a rare situation where there is wide agreement on the subject between other experts in the field. And the great majority of experts, over 97%, essentially believe something else. So his opinion is very, very much the minority of experts and should be considered accordingly. Right? My favorite example of this was in the 90s. I remember this was around the mid 90s. There was this biology professor from Berkeley, and he was a Berkeley incredibly good school. He had tons of publications, and he was arguing that you cannot get HIV through sex. Right? Um, Obviously, this was a message lots of people wanted to hear because they did not want to use protection during sex. It was a message that actually led to South Africa actually inviting him as an expert to help them with their AIDS policy. The great majority of experts essentially disagreed on this subject, right? They said, of course, you can get AIDS and HIV through sex. Um, Again, being the lone guy should be a really big red flag that this person is not an expert to be trusted. There's also questions of whether there are real knowledge claims to be made in the area. For example, in astronomy, clearly there are things you can know. But can you know anything in astrology? Well, no. You can know things about astrology. You can know how astrology is supposed to work. But because astrology is a pseudoscience, it's essentially an idea that somehow the stars are connected to your life in some undefined way that has no verification or no ability to be wrong in any way, apparently, doesn't really make it the kind of thing where you can have legitimate knowledge in. This is because knowledge is justified true belief, and that's the typical way we think of knowledge. And there's really no way to be justified in your beliefs about astrology. Finally, is there any reason to think that the person in question is biased? There's been lots of instances. For example, let's say climate scientists who are paid by the oil industry, right, to say that climate change is not a product of human activity or that climate change is not happening. If they're being paid by the oil industry, well, that's a very good reason for you to not trust what they're saying. In fact, if anyone's getting paid to say something, you really want to question whether they really mean what they're saying or whether they're just saying it for the money, even if they are an expert. Okay, so all these are ways to think about an expert. When you get to your documentary analysis and you're analyzing the experts, I really want you to think about them. Okay, along with this comes the issue. So, how do you in your everyday life essentially determine if someone is an expert? The first obvious one is education and training from reputable institutions or programs in the relevant field. Usually, you get a degree, right? So, you guys are here to get a degree. When you're applying for a job, somebody's going to look at that and they're going to say, "Oh yeah, okay, they got a degree from." From this place, so they have, let's say, expertise in the subject. And notice it matters also where you went, right? So a degree from, let's say, Cal State LA is not going to be as impressive as a degree from UCLA, right? Because the reputation of the institution is not as strong, right? It's known to not produce people who have the same level of expertise. This is why if a physicist from MIT or Caltech is incredibly impressive as opposed to, let's say, a far less impressive physicist still also with a PhD from, let's say, Cal State LA. Okay. Second, experience making reliable judgments in the field. So let's say this person is a proven source, right? They've made good choices in the field. They've done good work, right? They have that kind of experience, right? Usually, the more experience you have, the better you are, right? Especially if you've proven yourself through experience. Let's say you're thinking of a casting agent and you're looking for a casting agent. Well, the more they've worked as a casting agent and the more they've done so well, so that they have things to show for it, the more you would consider them someone worth hiring and an expert. And the third one is reputation among peers. So, what do other experts think of them? So, let's say it's a casting agent. What do other casting agents think of this casting agent? Let's say you're talking about a physicist, right? What do other physicists think about this physicist? Think about the example I gave you, the Berkeley biologist who said that you couldn't get AIDS through sex. What did other experts on AIDS really think about him? Well, they thought he was nuts on this issue, and that matters a lot. And last one, professional accomplishments. Right? What have you done to show for your expertise? Let's go back to our casting agent. If the casting agent has a resume, and on a resume is, I did, this big movie, this big movie, this big movie, this big movie, lots of them have won awards, well, that's very impressive. If the resume says, I worked on a couple of student productions and they didn't make it to, they weren't accepted by any film festivals, well, that's not impressive. Okay. Now we've done all the fallacies. Again, I know there are a whole lot of them. So at this point, here's what you want to do. You want to take the handout. You want to review those fallacies. You want to go and take the quiz online, right? The quiz on Google Classroom is going to be very, very helpful to you in terms of making sure that you understood this material. And of course, you got to do it, so go do it anyway. I'll see you in class, and we're going to do a whole bunch of stuff with these fallacies.